to Haunted and Historic Australia. Today we have another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts, where we look at the first night watch set up in the early colony. From what we have learned in previous episodes, there wasn't a good hold on the behaviour of the colony. Governor Phillip was amazed at how many would risk their lives to steal, and not just the convicts, but the soldiers who were appointed to keep the convicts in line had also been behaving badly, as 6 Marines were caught stealing and hung as a result. The Royal Marines who accompanied the First Fleet refused to carry out the duties of a police force. Their commander, Major Robert Ross, stated that they were soldiers, not prison guards, and it was insulting to His Majesty's regiment to expect them to act in such a role. They did agree to guard the settlement and patrol at night. Governor Phillip appointed a free man, James Smith, as a peace officer, but he retired after a brief period. He was deemed too old and infirm to be effective. In the hopes of deterring thievery, others were hung. However, the thievery continued, and by mid-1789 it had become so bad that thievery was a daily occurrence. The colony was in real trouble. A convict named John Harris had an idea. John Harris, born approximately 1759, was a Jewish man who was transported to Australia aboard the Scarborough in the First Fleet for stealing silver spoons. At a time when stealing was running rife, he put forward a scheme to the Judge Advocate David Collins on a solution to the nightly thievery that was destroying the colony. John had the idea of a night's watch made up of the most well-behaved, trusted convict men to keep watch over all going on at night, to apprehend anyone lurking around in hours where there was curfew. Now anyone would say, "Are you kidding? A band of convicts to watch the colony? Thieves stopping thievery? What a laugh." Well, the colony was desperate, and David Collins knew their options were few. Harris was a smart man. This was a great opportunity for a select few to get ahead without breaking the law. Collins took the scheme to the governor. They discussed it with Major Robert Ross of the Marines. From the meeting came the steps toward forming the New South Wales Police. At this time, before the Second Fleet arrived, there were approximately 1,000 convicts in the settlement, 100 huts, some tents and a few public buildings. The night watch was put together by Arthur Phillip and David Collins. 12 convict men divided into 4 groups of 3 men, as the settlement was at this time divided into 4 districts. 3 men assigned to a district, one of which was a principal and 2 subordinates. They were to patrol all night to keep an eye on felons, trespassers or misdemeanours. They had the power to enter a suspicious premises and by any means necessary apprehend the individuals. Even soldiers or seamen who were caught out after tap-to were to be taken to the nearest guard room, no matter what time of night. The watch were to report all gambling or selling, bartering clothes or rations to the Judge Advocate Collins by 12 the next day. The night watch members were not paid, or not initially anyway. They were volunteers. There were regulations for the members of the night watch. The first being 12 members patrol nightly. The apprehending of suspected felon, trespass or misdemeanour by any means necessary. 2. Areas of convict huts and public farm on the east side of the cove is Division 1. Those at brick kilns and detached parties, farms are Division 2. Those on western side as far as the line separating the women and men convicts is Division 3. and the huts occupied from that line to the hospital and then to the observatory is Division 4. The third regulation was each district is under the inspection of the principal, who needs to make himself familiar with those of the district he managed. Regulation 4. The principal must also be aware of those in his district who have or are suspected of selling, bartering clothes and rations, which is to be reported to Collins. The fifth was, any soldier or seaman found after Tap 2 is to be apprehended and detained to the nearest guardhouse. Number 6 was, anyone robbed is to contact the watch in his district immediately, so as that the efforts could be made to apprehend the thief. The 7th was, the watch are to be under supervision of John Herbert Keeling. The watch are not to accept bribes. Number 8 was, the watch are to begin once Tap 2 has finished beating, and to return to their huts concluding the watch when the working drum beats in the morning. All reports to be made to David Collins by 12 p.m. by Herbert Keeling. Number 9 was, any watch member that broke the law would be punished with the utmost rigour of the law. Now, the 12 watchmen that were initially selected were John Harris, being that it was his idea, Herbert Keeling, who was apparently one of the most trusted convicts that the government had. There was also William Bradbury, Charles Peat, William Hubbard, Thomas Oldfield, John Cohen Walsh, Stephen LeGrove, John Neal, and John Archer. Like any goody two-shoes or teacher's pet, the volunteer watchmen were despised by many of the other convicts, kind of like snitches, but were not discouraged. The first night watch commenced on the 8th of August 1789. Within only a week of commencing, John Harris had arrested Captain Lieutenant James Meredith, trying to break into a home of a Sarah Bellamy, who was a widow, along with a man named James Kelty, the master of the Sirius. Although both men were in court the next morning, no charges were laid. This happened frequently, where convicts picked up Marines and sent them to the guardroom. The Marine commander, Major Robert Ross, advised David Collins that convicts picking up Marines was an insult to them. They would not tolerate being controlled if not a real offence had been committed. Ross and Phillip discussed this, and Governor Phillip made an amendment to the 5th regulation not to stop Marines unless they are in a riot or committing an unlawful act. David Collins noted in his diary at the time that many streets in the metropolis of London were not so well guarded and watched as the small but rising town of Sydney. David also makes note of the loathing by other convicts of the watch members. By February 1790, the beginning of a large guardhouse began on the east side of the cove, near the Tank Stream Bridge, which was a position that the watch could quickly access anywhere in the 4 districts, as well as convenient for housing of prisoners. They indeed needed this, as the Second Fleet Justinian had still not arrived, and the watch were kept busy as the colony was full of unrest and empty bellies. By April, things were boiling over. The governor's garden was even raided by a Marine, and on another occasion a seaman was shot by the watchman, only wounding him. The Reverend Richard Johnson handed a thief who he had caught in his garden over to the night watch also. At this point we understand that the night watch were also being called the Sydney Foot Police, and they had expanded now to Parramatta and Hawkesbury area. Eventually in June saw the arrival of the Second Fleet, and as we know from previous episodes, It wasn't all that exciting. First the women on the Lady Juliana arrived, and then the death fleet with all those sick convicts. It must have been an awful time in the colony. However, the Justinian arrived too, which meant a lot more rations for everybody. Although there were more people than what we originally had in way of convicts and hungry people, we still had enough to go on for at least this time. Many of the original members of the Night's Watch were no longer there. John Harris had been sent to watch at Norfolk Island. The watch was still very much needed, as there were more thieves now in the colony. The watch had many crimes associated with liquor that had come in. Convicts were selling their rations for money to buy spirits, but then later on, when they were hungry, they had no food, which they then had to steal. Another Marine was caught stealing spirits from the commissary house. The watch was sent to man the docks, as this was where many of the spirits were illegally being brought in during the night hours, as at this time there were many ships in the harbour. Even Christmas Day was not without its drama. 22 gallons of spirits were stolen from the Marine store. Nighttime thievery increased as the population did. 12 men in the Night's Watch could no longer keep this down. They needed to expand further. The Night's Watch were instructed to shoot all stragglers after Tap 2. Tap 2 is a term that began in the 1600s during the wartime. It was used by the Dutch initially when they had to get their troops back to base. They would play Doden Tap Toe, which is Dutch for turn off the tap. It was instruction to the pubs and innkeepers to stop serving beer. So this would rein in all the soldiers at night. It was instructed to play till 22 hours or 10 p.m. at night. The name changed to Tap 2 and then to Tattoo, like the Edinburgh Tattoo, where it's a military band playing, which is now played for formal events and for the enjoyment of music lovers. Therefore, in the Australian early settlement, it was used to have the convicts, marines and seamen back to their huts and tents for the night. Even George Barrington, who ended up being the superintendent of the convicts, started out in the Night's Watch, Sydney Foot Police, in 1791. The robbers became brazen in 1792, even cutting a man with an axe to his arm when he resisted the mugging him. The same man who did this was also thought to have looted the hospital, a reward of free rations to anyone who could bring them to justice, although there were no takers on this. It was thought that many of the convicts were banding together to save each other. One woman even declared that she'd been molested, however would not give up the man who did this, as she feared he would be hung, and possibly any repercussions to her after the fact. Some convicts, it was found, stole so as not to work. Others stole so as that they could pay their way onto ships and be smuggled back to England or any other area the ships may be going. One of the ships, the Britannia, was suspected of harbouring a few convicts, as a house had been burgled only a few days before she departed. In October 1792, stores were opening in Sydney and permitted to sell spirits. However, as a result, free settlers and convicts both abused the alcohol. Once again, the watch was busy. In December, Governor Phillip retired. He left to go back to England. He had completed his term. A Lieutenant Governor Major Francis Grose took up the position, or acting position, until another governor could come in, but gets on the nerves of David Collins, as now there were more people that the watch had to update daily. A bench of Reverend Richard Johnson, Augustus Alt and Richard Atkins, Deputy Judge Advocate, as well as David Collins, are now looking after the watch. Throughout 1793, the majority of cases were thefts, drunken disorderlies, and on occasion being sent along the road from Sydney to Parramatta to protect travellers from the First People, as at this time, after Governor Phillip's game shooter was attacked by Pemulwuy and killed, there was a little bit of unrest between the both. By Christmas Day 1793, David Collins wrote, "The passion for liquor was so predominant amongst the people that it operated like a mania, thereby nothing they wouldn't risk to obtain it." It seemed that the convicts, and now free settlers as well, were becoming unruly, not over the shortage of rations, but the abundance of liquor. Into 1794, gambling became a regular reason for mugging. Trying to obtain money for the liquor, many who won at gambling tents were attacked on the way back to their tents and huts, and the winnings stolen, sometimes by more than a few muggers at a time, ganging up on one person. Illegal gambling huts had lookouts outside who knew the faces of the night watchmen, and the game was abandoned whenever the watchmen came past. But the settlement had grown significantly, and they could not monitor all of the huts at one time. The homes of Reverend Richard Johnson, as well as the government house, were hit again. Men were hung, yet still no deterring people from thieving. By February 1795, there were many convicts that ran off into the bush and were known as bushrangers. The watchmen were often sent to try and apprehend them. A watchman member even shot a convict bushranger who was in the act of burgling, which, as per David Collins, forced the bushrangers further away from Sydney. John Hunter now became the Governor of New South Wales in the October of 1795, and the term watchman being confused with constable a bit, he takes a lot of Governor Phillip's ways, and David Collins assumes control again. He allows the watchmen to employ 4 convicts under them to assist them with their duties. Now at this stage, David also makes mention of the problem with the tank stream, where the tank stream had been boarded off against all the other houses with planks and fence palings. A lot of the townspeople had taken these fence palings to use on their huts and homes, thus leaving the tank stream open to flooding and polluted water to run into the fresh water that the colony was drinking from. It had now polluted so much they had to think of other ways to clean their water. He mentions that it was now a police issue to fix the fence once again. The group of bushrangers we know, led by John Caesar, stole many of the firearms from commissary. This led Governor Hunter to act. This is when he decided a reward for Caesar's capture and the collection of the firearms, which brought about a bounty hunter named John Winbow, who shot Caesar dead. John Hunter, in March of 1796, was very concerned about the amount of drunkenness among lower orders. He must have meant convicts and maybe the free people who didn't have a lot of money. He called upon the watchmen officers and magistrates to assist in stopping the illegal trafficking of liquor. More was getting onto the streets than had been allowed from the ships. With more alcohol available, it was easier to obtain, and the more drunken, disorderly people committing crimes, some dying from intoxication and others being shot through thievery, it had to come to an end. St. Patrick's Day for both 1795 and 1796 saw many of the Irish convicts arrested. David Collins makes mention that the prisons were full. In March 1796, two night watchmen were assaulted while doing their rounds. They came upon two burglars and, in trying to apprehend them, were assaulted. There was a hunt for these men as they were being harboured near the brick kilns. They were able to find one, but the other eluded them, and they shot the man that they caught. The watchmen who shot that man were brought to court the next day, but the case was dismissed. Hunter now believes that the watchmen need more incentives to do well. They had already been receiving liquor as an enticement to stay honest. They were now given an extra suit of clothing, so as that they looked respectable, and they continued getting a pint of spirit each Saturday. Governor Hunter also had other incentives, such as a reduce in their sentence. For example, those who were to serve 7 years but had completed 3 years as a night watchman would have the rest of their sentence pardoned. They could also be emancipated and leave the settlement if they chose to. Similar those who had a sentence of 14 years. If they served 7 years in the night's watch, the rest of their sentence would be pardoned. Now those who had the sentence of life in Australia and served 10 years as a night watchman, they would be emancipated, however could not leave the settlement, therefore spending the rest of their time in New South Wales. For those chief constables they deemed honest, made up of free settlers, were paid a salary. The colony faced much ship thievery, as now in 1796 many ships were docking in Sydney. This was found to be the shipmasters allowing convicts aboard. One evening in June of 1796, the house of the Superintendent of Convicts, Thomas Clark, was broken into and much of his property stolen. The watch was on to the culprits, and after some information was given from watch informants, they found one of the men responsible in a house near the brickfields. Another got away, and the watch pulled the house down as a warning for anyone tried to harbour fugitives. Governor Hunter, as per Governor Phillip before him, divides Sydney into divisions again, and also numbering houses. He also asks the townspeople from each division to elect a principal watchman for that year. Watchmen were also appointed to the military division of the town. Volunteer watchmen were now entitled to full rations for themselves and their families. They were also given a set of instructions so as that there couldn't be any reason to claim ignorance. We see Governor Hunter has reorganised the police force to become more in line with what they are doing back in London. And now the Night's Watch and Sydney Police are under the control of the local magistrates. By June of 1797, a log jail is erected in Sydney, containing 22 cells, in which a convict of the Night's Watch, John Redman, is stationed. There were now many more of the Night Watch and Sydney Police than back in 1789, almost 10 years ago now. Almost at the same time, a jail is also built in Parramatta, and the Night's Watch over the next few years would rise to 36 strong, manning the areas between Parramatta and Sydney. The police were not without their own fault, unfortunately, as the majority of these night watchmen and police were paid in alcohol rather than money. A lot of them were dismissed for the same reason, as they were drunken and disorderly as a result of their payment. However, of the best behaved, the force only grew stronger. It also grew in other departments, including the Water Police, the Mounted Police, and the Mounted Aboriginal Police. The first people were utilised within the police force initially as trackers. They assisted the police in tracking individuals within the bush that they needed to apprehend. They were a vital part of the success of this police force. The water police had actually been part of the night watch from the beginning, where they had some of the men in rowboats guarding the harbour and foreshores. The night watch, who were sent down to the harbour, were there to detect smuggling and prevent letters being passed between convicts and the members of the sailing crew, often to prevent them smuggling convicts out of Sydney, as well as the smuggling of alcohol onto the streets. On the 26th of August 1803, we find the first murder of one of our Sydney foot police or night watchmen. Constable Luca was on a midnight patrol after a range of different burglaries near prostitute Mary Breeze's brothel in Phillip Street, then known as Back Row, east of Sydney town. He was set upon by a group of offenders and beaten to death. Poor Constable Luca sustained severe head wounds when he was set upon by the group, which is quite gruesome for this time. His body was found near Macquarie Street. 4 men later faced court for the murder: a Joseph Samuel, James Hardwick, Richard Jackson, and a constable, Isaac Simmons. There was also another constable that they suspected, a constable, William Bladders. However, all but Joseph Samuel were acquitted. An interesting story unfolds when Joseph is taken to the noose. Reverend Richard Johnson is there to get a confession, and what Joseph says is most interesting. He claims that Constable Isaac Simmons was the one who killed Constable Joseph Luca. Joseph Samuels says that Constable Isaac Simmons told him in the cell that Constable Joseph Luca had interrupted him, and as a result, he'd hit him, and then hit him again for good luck. But this doesn't really seem to account for all the wounds that Constable Joseph Luca encountered. Surgeon John White had said that whoever had hit Constable Joseph Luca so hard with his own cutlass would have had to have grabbed the cutlass at the blade end and then hit him on the head so hard that it embedded in his skull 1.5 inches. It's such a gruesome murder, and sadly there was no justice in the end. There was even more of an interesting tale about how Joseph Samuels was hung, but we'll get to that in the next episode. Constable Joseph Luca was buried in Sydney's first cemetery, which was subsequently moved as Town Hall Station was placed upon it. Many of the bodies are still located under Town Hall Station, but we do know that Constable Luca's body was moved to Rookwood Cemetery. Constable Luca was only 35 years old and had been a member of the Sydney Police Night Watch for some years. He was the first of the Australian police to be killed on duty. In 1810, Lachlan Macquarie took over being the Governor of New South Wales. He had a few things to look after, as by now the city was full of traffic, horse-drawn traffic. There were many horses pulling carts around town, and the traffic had to have some order to it, as there were, interestingly enough, accidents of people running into each other. He introduced registration for carts, drays and wagons, as well as the roads had tolls payable to use between Sydney and Parramatta. Governor Macquarie establishes a police fund, and the city is now divided into 5 police districts, each with its own watch house. In 1811, Governor Macquarie appoints our old mate Darcy Wentworth as the police superintendent. By 1817, there are now 60 constables in the Sydney Foot Police, and only 2 years later, another watch house built, that being 6 now in Sydney town. In 1828, there were 75 men, a chief constable, 5 wardsmen, 11 conductors, 56 patrolmen, constables and a runner. In 1831, They were now stationed at Penrith, Illawarra, Campbelltown, Maitland and Parramatta. There were 99 men in the Sydney Foot Police or Sydney Police from the Night Watchmen in 1834. In 1848, a large riot takes place in Sydney at the Watch House of St James. The Watch House and a courthouse are attacked by a mob, and the Mounted Aboriginal Police Unit was established. The Watchmen and Sydney Foot Police, or Sydney Police, continue patrolling all the way until 1862, where the population of Sydney is 85,000, and the Sydney Foot Police now become the New South Wales Police. It was quite interesting finding out about the information of the Night Watch, how quickly they became a real force, and to think that they were simply convicts in the beginning. Thank you for watching this episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. We hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for our next episode where we find out what happened at the Noose with Joseph Samuels, followed closely by the first unsolved murder in Sydney. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming episodes.